Sometimes the safest place in the world is the one that makes absolutely no sense. I never imagined that the man every news station described as the most ruthless Alpha Mafia boss in Seattle would fall asleep with his head resting quietly against my shoulder like someone who had finally reached home after years of searching. It happened on the last commuter train just after 11 o'clock on a rainy Thursday night. I had just finished a late shift at the small independent bookstore where I worked, carrying nothing more exciting than a canvas bag filled with returned novels and a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The train was almost empty except for a handful of exhausted passengers staring at their phones or watching the rain race across the windows. When the doors opened at Pioneer Square Station, a tall man wearing a perfectly tailored black overcoat stepped inside. He looked calm, composed, and strangely familiar, although I could not immediately remember where I had seen his face before. He quietly sat beside me without saying a single word. I shifted slightly to give him more room, assuming he was simply another office worker heading home after a long day. Then something unexpected happened. Only a few minutes after the train began moving again, his shoulders slowly relaxed. His breathing became slower. Before I even realized what was happening, his head gently leaned against my shoulder as though it had found the only comfortable place left in the entire city. I froze. Every instinct told me to wake him immediately, but something about the overwhelming exhaustion written across his face stopped me. He did not look dangerous. He looked tired beyond words. The train remained almost silent until a young couple sitting across from us suddenly looked up from their phones. The color drained from the man's face. He whispered something into his girlfriend's ear, and both of them immediately stood and hurried toward the opposite end of the train. One by one, other passengers noticed my sleeping companion. Some quietly left our train car at the next stop. Others pretended not to look while stealing nervous glances in our direction. Confused, I finally searched his face more carefully. Then my own heart nearly stopped. I recognized him instantly from newspaper headlines and television reports. Vincent Hale, the Alpha Mafia boss whose name had become almost legendary throughout Seattle. Stories claimed he never trusted anyone, never lowered his guard, and rarely allowed people to stand within arm's reach of him. Yet somehow he was peacefully asleep against my shoulder as if none of those stories had ever existed. I could not understand why. I barely knew this man. In fact, I had never spoken to him before in my life. The train continued crossing the rain-soaked city while I remained completely still, afraid that even the smallest movement might wake him. For nearly 20 minutes, Vincent did not stir once. His expression, usually described by every article as cold and unreadable, softened into something unexpectedly human. There was no arrogance, no fear, only quiet relief. As the train approached the final downtown station, he slowly opened his eyes and immediately realized where he had been resting. Instead of pulling away in embarrassment, he looked at me for several long seconds with an expression I could not explain. Then he gave a faint, almost grateful smile before quietly saying, "I finally slept." Without another word, he stood, adjusted his coat, stepped onto the platform, and disappeared into the rain, leaving me with one impossible question that would change everything I thought I understood about him and, before long, about my own ordinary life. 3 days earlier, my biggest concern had been whether the mystery novels displayed in the front window of Harbor Page's bookstore would attract enough customers before the weekend. I had worked there for nearly 4 years, and every morning followed the same comforting routine. I unlocked the old wooden door just before 8 o'clock, switched on the warm reading lamps scattered between the shelves, brewed a fresh pot of coffee for customers, and carefully arranged new arrivals beside handwritten recommendation cards. The bookstore was tucked into a quiet corner of downtown Seattle, surrounded by small family-owned businesses that still believed. People preferred conversations over convenience. My life was simple, predictable, and exactly the way I liked it. Most evenings ended with me carrying home another used novel that someone else had decided to leave behind. I had never imagined that my ordinary routine would collide with someone whose name seemed to belong to an entirely different world. That afternoon, heavy rain swept across the city much earlier than expected. Customers hurried inside simply to escape the weather, filling the shop with dripping umbrellas and the earthy scent of wet pavement. Around closing time, the rain became even stronger, and I noticed a man standing alone beneath the bookstore awning. He wore a dark coat with the collar raised against the wind, making it difficult to recognize his face. He appeared exhausted, almost as though he had been walking for hours without deciding where he actually wanted to go. I stepped outside holding an extra umbrella that had been left behind several months earlier. "You can borrow this if you need it," I said. The stranger looked at me with quiet surprise before accepting it with a polite nod. "Thank you," he answered softly. His voice was calm, measured, and carried an unexpected weariness that lingered long after the brief conversation ended. Before leaving, he glanced toward the bookstore window where an old first edition of a classic American novel rested on display. "You still keep books that people think the world has forgotten," he remarked. I smiled. Sometimes forgotten things are exactly what someone is searching for. He held my gaze for another moment, as though those words meant more to him than I intended, then disappeared into the rain. I thought little about the encounter until the following morning. The umbrella had been returned before opening hours, carefully folded and leaning beside the front door. Tucked beneath the handle was a brand new copy of the same novel that had been displayed in my window, along with a small handwritten note. "Thank you for reminding me that some places still feel honest." There was no signature. I assumed it had come from the quiet stranger and placed the book behind the counter, thinking it was one of the more unusual acts of kindness I had experienced. Later that afternoon, my coworker Emma noticed the book and casually asked who had brought it. When I explained the story, she laughed before pointing toward the local newspaper lying near the register. The front page featured a photograph of Vincent Hale attending a charity fundraiser the previous evening. The moment I saw his face, my stomach tightened. It was the same man who had borrowed my umbrella. I stared at the photograph in disbelief. The headlines described him as an untouchable alpha whose business empire reached every corner of the city, yet the person I had met had looked less like a powerful leader and more like someone carrying an invisible weight that no one else seemed willing to notice. I folded the newspaper and returned to helping customers, convinced our paths would never cross again, completely unaware that destiny had already begun arranging a second meeting neither of us could avoid. The next 2 days should have been completely ordinary, yet every time I looked at the neatly folded umbrella standing behind the bookstore counter, I found myself thinking about the quiet stranger whose tired eyes did not seem to match the frightening stories printed in every newspaper. I told myself it was nothing more than curiosity. After all, Seattle was a large city, and people from completely different worlds crossed paths every day without ever meeting again. That belief lasted exactly 48 hours. Saturday afternoon brought a steady stream of customers searching for weekend reading, and harbor pages felt alive with soft conversations, turning pages, and the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Around 3 o'clock, the front door opened, and an unexpected silence settled across the room. I glanced up from arranging a display of historical fiction and immediately recognized Vincent Hale. This time he was not hiding beneath the collar of a rain-soaked coat. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit beneath a long black overcoat, and despite his composed appearance, there was still a trace of exhaustion around his eyes that only someone who had looked closely before would notice. Several customers quietly whispered after recognizing him, but Vincent seemed completely unaware of the attention. Instead of walking directly toward me, he slowly wandered through the shelves, carefully reading the handwritten recommendation cards attached to different books. He stopped in front of a collection of classic American literature and smiled faintly at one of my handwritten notes that read, "Every great story reminds us that even the strongest people become lost sometimes." I could not explain why seeing him smile felt so unexpected. When he finally approached the register, he placed 3 novels on the counter without saying anything. They were all stories about redemption, forgiveness, and second chances. As I scanned the books, I quietly asked, "Did you enjoy The Umbrella?" He looked up, surprised that I remembered him. "Very much," he replied. "It carried me farther than you probably imagined." Before I could answer, an elderly customer standing nearby accidentally dropped several hardcover books while trying to reach her wallet. Vincent reacted before anyone else. He immediately knelt beside her, carefully gathering every book without the slightest hint of impatience. He even carried the stack to her car after she admitted her shoulder had been bothering her for weeks. No cameras were present. No reporters stood outside waiting for photographs. No one appeared to notice except me. It was a simple act of kindness that completely contradicted everything I had ever heard about him. When Vincent returned, he quietly accepted the shopping bag I handed him. "Thank you," I said without thinking. He tilted his head slightly. "For what?" I hesitated before answering honestly. "For reminding me that newspapers do not always know the whole story." For a brief moment, something softened behind his normally unreadable expression. "Neither do people," he said gently. Then he walked toward the exit, disappearing into the afternoon crowd as quietly as he had arrived. Emma leaned against the nearby bookshelf the moment the door closed. "You know," she whispered with a grin, "that is the longest conversation I have ever seen anyone have with Vincent Hale." Without looking terrified, I laughed awkwardly, pretending the encounter meant nothing. But later that evening, while closing the bookstore, I noticed a black luxury sedan parked across the street. It remained there for several minutes before slowly driving away without approaching the entrance. I told myself it was probably unrelated, yet a strange feeling settled in my chest. For the first time, I began to wonder whether our repeated meetings were truly accidental, or whether an invisible story had already begun unfolding around both of us long before either of us realized it. The following Monday began like every other workday, yet I could not shake the strange feeling that someone had quietly rearranged the direction of my life without asking my permission. Harbor Pages opened at 8 o'clock as usual. Customers browsed peacefully through the shelves, and the familiar scent of coffee drifted through the bookstore, but my thoughts repeatedly wandered back to Vincent Hale and the impossible contrast between the man I had met and the reputation that surrounded him. Around noon, a well-dressed man entered the bookstore carrying himself with effortless confidence. He introduced himself as Lucas Mercer, explaining that he represented a charitable literacy foundation interested in supporting small, independent bookstores throughout Seattle. His warm smile and relaxed manner immediately put everyone at ease. He spent nearly an hour asking thoughtful questions about our community reading programs, local schools, and the challenges faced by neighborhood businesses. Before leaving, he generously purchased several $100s worth of children's books, asking that they be donated to nearby libraries rather than packaged for him. It was the kind of kindness no bookstore owner could ignore. As he prepared to leave, Lucas paused beside the counter and casually asked, "You met Vincent Hale recently, did not you?" I looked at him with surprise. "How did you know that?" Lucas gave a small laugh. "Seattle is not as large as people think." His expression remained friendly, yet his voice became noticeably quieter. "Please be careful. Vincent has a habit of becoming interested in decent people whenever he needs something. Once he gets what he wants, he disappears." I frowned. That does not sound like the man I met. Lucas nodded sympathetically as though he had expected my answer. Very few people ever believe the warnings at first. Before I could ask another question, he politely wished me a good afternoon and walked away. His words lingered in my mind long after the bookstore became quiet again. That evening, while walking home through downtown Seattle, I noticed the same black luxury sedan parked across the street for the second time in 3 days. It remained there only briefly before driving away the moment I looked directly toward it. I could not tell whether it belonged to Vincent, to Lucas, or to someone else entirely. Across the city, Vincent sat alone inside a conference room overlooking Elliott Bay, reviewing reports spread across a long wooden table. His trusted security director quietly entered carrying several photographs. "The bookstore employee has been approached," he reported. Vincent immediately looked up. "By whom?" The answer came without hesitation. "Lucas Mercer." Vincent's expression remained calm, but the silence that followed felt heavier than any spoken response. He slowly examined one of the photographs showing Lucas leaving Harbor Pages only hours earlier. "Increase observation," Vincent said evenly. "Do not interfere unless his safety is genuinely at risk." The security director nodded before asking the obvious question. "Should we tell him the truth?" Vincent looked out across the gray Seattle skyline for several thoughtful seconds. "Not yet. He deserves evidence, not another stranger asking for trust." Later that night, I unlocked my apartment and found a small package resting outside my door with no return address. Inside was a first edition bookmark handcrafted from polished walnut, carefully engraved with a single sentence. "Every story changes when the missing chapter is finally found." There was no signature, only the faint outline of a small lighthouse carved into the wood. I turned the bookmark over several times, unable to understand who had sent it or why. At that exact moment, somewhere across the city, Lucas smiled quietly while crossing another carefully planned step off his invisible list, convinced that every new misunderstanding brought Owen Carter and Vincent Hale one step closer to the future he had secretly designed for both of them. By Wednesday morning, I had almost convinced myself that the strange package, the mysterious bookmark, and my unexpected encounters with Vincent Hale were nothing more than a series of unlikely coincidences. Harbor Pages was busy preparing for a neighborhood literacy fundraiser that weekend, and the familiar rhythm of unpacking new books and greeting regular customers slowly pulled my attention back to ordinary life. Even so, every time the front door opened, a small part of me wondered whether Vincent would quietly walk inside again. Instead, another familiar face appeared. Lucas Mercer greeted everyone with the same warm smile, carrying several boxes filled with donated children's books. He cheerfully helped arrange them on display tables before inviting the bookstore staff to join him for coffee after closing. During the conversation, he casually mentioned that he had worked with influential business leaders for years. Without directly criticizing Vincent, he shared carefully selected stories about ambitious executives who often surrounded themselves with ordinary people whenever they needed a trustworthy public image. Power has a way of borrowing kindness, Lucas said thoughtfully while stirring his coffee. The difficult part is realizing when your kindness has become someone else's strategy. His words settled heavily in my mind because they sounded reasonable rather than dramatic. I wanted to disagree, yet I could not completely dismiss the possibility. Across the city, Vincent sat inside a quiet conference room reviewing another collection of surveillance reports with his security director. The latest photographs showed Lucas visiting several locations connected to Harbor Pages during the previous week, including a nearby coffee shop, a neighborhood community center, and even the apartment building where I lived. Vincent slowly closed the folder. He is building familiarity before creating dependency, he observed. His security director nodded. We still do not know his final objective. Vincent remained silent for several moments before answering. Find out who authorized the Literacy Foundation donations. I do not believe they are random. Later that afternoon, I left the bookstore carrying several donated books for a local elementary school only a few blocks away. Halfway there, I realized someone had accidentally left an expensive leather portfolio on a bench outside the community center. Thinking it belonged to one of the volunteers, I picked it up and carried it inside. Before I could ask whether anyone had lost it, Vincent entered through another doorway while meeting with organizers supporting the same literacy event. We stopped several feet apart, equally surprised to see each other again. You keep appearing in unexpected places, I said with an awkward smile. Vincent looked at the portfolio in my hands before replying calmly. Perhaps we are both following the same story without realizing it. Before either of us could continue, Lucas approached from behind and immediately thanked me for finding the portfolio. He accepted it with obvious relief before turning toward Vincent with perfect politeness. I appreciate your company continuing to support these community programs, he said pleasantly. Vincent acknowledged him with a brief nod, but something in his expression changed almost imperceptibly. It was the first time I had seen him become quietly guarded around another person. The meeting ended only minutes later, yet as I walked back toward the bookstore, I could not shake the feeling that an invisible conversation had taken place between the two men without either of them speaking openly. That evening, Vincent's security director returned with new financial records linking the Literacy Foundation to a consulting firm that had quietly changed ownership several months earlier. One signature appeared repeatedly throughout the documents, hidden beneath layers of legal paperwork, but impossible to ignore once discovered. It belonged to Lucas Mercer, and for the first time Vincent realized the coincidences surrounding Owen Carter had never been coincidences at all. The discovery hidden inside those financial records did not change my life immediately because I knew nothing about them, but somehow the atmosphere around me began shifting in ways that were impossible to ignore. The following morning, Harbor Pages felt strangely quieter than usual. Several regular customers mentioned seeing unfamiliar luxury vehicles parked along the street during the previous week. Emma joked that perhaps a famous author had secretly moved into the neighborhood, but the comment left me thinking about the same black sedan I had noticed more than once. I tried to dismiss the uneasy feeling and focused on preparing the bookstore for Saturday's literacy fundraiser. Shortly before lunch, Lucas arrived carrying fresh promotional flyers and greeted everyone with his usual warmth. He complimented the decorations, thanked us again for supporting the event, and asked whether I would be willing to help distribute donated books during the opening ceremony. His request sounded perfectly reasonable, and I happily agreed. Before leaving, he smiled and said, "It is nice to know there are still people who choose trust before suspicion." The sentence lingered in my thoughts long after he disappeared through the front door. Across the city, Vincent sat inside his office studying every document his investigators had collected overnight. The ownership records, charitable donations, and communication logs all pointed toward the same conclusion. Lucas had carefully positioned himself near Owen without ever appearing threatening. Every encounter had been designed to look accidental, every conversation crafted to influence rather than inform. Vincent quietly closed the final folder. "He wants Owen to distrust me before he learns the truth," he said. His security director nodded. "Then we should explain everything immediately." Vincent slowly shook his head. "Not without proof that Owen can verify himself. If I ask him to believe my word against Lucas, I become exactly what Lucas has described." Instead, Vincent instructed his team to continue gathering evidence while maintaining a respectful distance. He refused to manipulate Owen, even if honesty required more patience. Late that afternoon, I volunteered to deliver several boxes of donated books to the community center hosting the fundraiser. As I finished unloading the final carton, I noticed a small bulletin board displaying photographs from previous literacy events. One picture immediately caught my attention. Lucas stood smiling beside local volunteers, but partially hidden in the background was Vincent speaking with a group of children while helping them choose books. There were no reporters, no photographers focused on him, and no signs announcing his company's sponsorship. It looked like someone had captured the moment by accident. Curious, I asked the community center director when the photograph had been taken. She smiled warmly. "About 2 years ago. Mr. Hale visits quietly every few months. He always asks us not to announce it because he says the day should belong to the children, not to him." I stared at the photograph far longer than I intended. It did not fit the image Lucas had carefully painted. On my walk back to the bookstore, I replayed every conversation I had shared with both men. Lucas always seemed eager to explain Vincent's motives. Vincent, by contrast, rarely explained himself at all. That difference suddenly felt important. As evening settled over Seattle, I unlocked my apartment building and found another small envelope resting beneath my door. Inside was a handwritten note containing only an address and a time for the following afternoon, along with a single sentence. "If you truly want answers, come alone." There was no signature, but somehow I knew the invitation had not been left by Vincent. Holding the note in my hands, I realized that the invisible story unfolding around my ordinary life had finally reached the point where I would have to decide whose version of the truth I was willing to follow. The address on the note led me to a quiet waterfront cafe overlooking Elliott Bay, a place I had passed dozens of times without ever stepping inside. The following afternoon, gray clouds drifted above the harbor while ferries crossed the water at an unhurried pace, making everything feel strangely peaceful despite the questions racing through my mind. I arrived 10 minutes early and chose a table near the window where I could watch both the entrance and the shoreline. Exactly at 2 o'clock, Lucas Mercer walked through the front door, carrying 2 cups of coffee, as though we had planned the meeting together for weeks. He smiled warmly before placing 1 cup in front of me. "Thank you for coming," he said. I looked at him carefully. "You sent the note." He nodded without hesitation. I thought it would be easier to talk somewhere quiet. For the next several minutes, Lucas spoke calmly about Vincent Hale. He never raised his voice or sounded emotional. Instead, he described Vincent as someone who believed every problem could be solved through careful planning and absolute control. "People admire confidence," Lucas explained, "but confidence can become another way of deciding what is best for everyone else." He leaned forward slightly. "You are different, Owen. You make your own decisions. I hope you keep it that way." His words sounded thoughtful, yet something felt incomplete. Every conclusion arrived without evidence, almost as though he expected me to accept his interpretation instead of asking questions. Remembering the photograph at the community center, I finally asked, "If Vincent only cares about appearances, Why did he quietly support literacy programs for years without telling anyone? Lucas paused for the first time since sitting down. His smile remained, but it no longer reached his eyes. Even complicated people occasionally do good things, he answered. That does not change who they really are. Before I could respond, my phone vibrated. The message came from an unknown number containing only a photograph. It showed the same cafe from across the street, taken only seconds earlier. Beneath the image were 8 simple words. Trust what you see, not what you are told. I immediately looked through the window. Parked discreetly across the street sat the familiar black sedan. No one approached the cafe. No one interrupted our conversation. Whoever had sent the message simply remained at a respectful distance. Lucas noticed me looking outside. Expecting someone? He asked casually. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Just thinking. When our meeting ended, Lucas insisted on paying for the coffee before wishing me a pleasant afternoon. As he walked away, I noticed him greeting 2 different people on the sidewalk with remarkable familiarity, exchanging friendly smiles that appeared completely effortless. Everything about him encouraged trust. Yet for reasons I could not fully explain, I left the cafe feeling more uncertain than when I had arrived. That evening, I returned to Harbor Pages to finish preparing for the literacy fundraiser. Emma handed me a sealed envelope that had arrived during my absence. Someone dropped this off for you, she said. Inside was a photocopy of several official donation records from the community center. Every contribution made under Vincent Hale's name had been submitted anonymously through independent organizations over the past 5 years. Attached to the documents was a handwritten note in familiar, careful handwriting. You deserve facts before opinions. Decide for yourself. There was still no signature, but this time I did not need one. For the first time since our paths had crossed, I realized Vincent had never once asked me to believe him. He had only given me opportunities to discover the truth on my own, and that quiet difference changed everything I thought I understood about both men. Saturday arrived with clear skies over Seattle, and Harbor Pages filled with families attending the neighborhood literacy fundraiser. Children hurried between colorful reading stations while volunteers handed out donated books, and for several hours the bookstore felt brighter than I had ever seen it. I should have been completely focused on helping the event run smoothly, yet the documents inside my backpack kept pulling my thoughts back to Vincent and Lucas. Every verified record pointed in one direction, while every conversation Lucas had carefully guided me through pointed in another. For the first time, I realized that facts remained consistent even when opinions changed. Shortly after noon, Lucas greeted visitors with his usual effortless charm, shaking hands with donors and thanking volunteers by name. He seemed perfectly at home, moving naturally from one conversation to the next. A little later, Vincent quietly entered through the side entrance wearing a simple navy jacket instead of the formal clothing I had grown accustomed to seeing him wear. There were no photographers, no announcement, and no attempt to draw attention to himself. He immediately joined a reading circle where several elementary school students were taking turns reading aloud from classic children's stories. He listened patiently, applauded every child with genuine enthusiasm, and even accepted a crayon drawing from a little girl who proudly declared that every hero deserved a lighthouse. Watching him fold the drawing carefully into his jacket pocket without realizing anyone else had noticed told me more than every newspaper headline I had ever read. During a brief break between activities, I finally walked over to him. "Can we talk?" I asked quietly. Vincent nodded without hesitation and followed me onto the bookstore's small back patio overlooking the alley. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then I removed the donation records from my backpack and held them toward him. "Why did you never tell me about these?" I asked. Vincent looked at the papers before meeting my eyes. "Because if I had handed them to you on the first day we met, you would have wondered what I wanted in return." His answer was so simple that it caught me completely off guard. "And now?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Now you found them because you asked questions instead of accepting easy answers." Before I could respond, Lucas stepped onto the patio with the same calm expression he always carried. "I thought I might find both of you here," he said pleasantly. His voice remained friendly, but there was a new sharpness beneath the surface. He admitted that he had arranged many of our meetings, not to harm either of us, but because he believed Vincent's carefully protected world needed someone who could challenge it. "Power isolates people," Lucas said evenly. I wanted to see whether either of you would choose trust after doubt instead of comfort before truth. I stared at him in disbelief. You manipulated all of this. Lucas accepted the accusation without argument. I created opportunities, he replied. Your decisions were always your own. Vincent remained remarkably calm. You underestimated one thing, he said. Lucas tilted his head slightly. What was that? Vincent looked toward me before answering. The truth does not become stronger because someone arranges it. It becomes stronger when someone discovers it freely. Lucas was silent for the first time since I had met him. As laughter from the bookstore drifted through the open doorway behind us, I suddenly understood that the real story had never been about choosing between two powerful men. It had been about deciding whether trust should be built from carefully crafted words or quietly proven actions. And at that moment, the answer finally felt unmistakably clear. Several weeks later, life at Harbor Pages slowly settled back into its familiar rhythm, yet nothing truly felt the same anymore. The literacy fundraiser had become the most successful event the neighborhood had ever hosted, not because of generous donations or impressive guests, but because hundreds of children had left carrying books they could finally call their own. The conversations surrounding Vincent Hale gradually faded from local gossip, while Lucas Mercer quietly stepped away from the foundation and accepted responsibility for the choices he had made. Before leaving Seattle for another consulting position, he stopped by the bookstore one final time. He offered a sincere apology, admitting that he had become so convinced he understood people that he had forgotten every individual deserved the freedom to discover the truth without someone arranging every step along the way. I accepted his apology, not because everything had been simple, but because holding on to resentment would have turned his mistakes into part of my own future. As for Vincent, he continued supporting community programs exactly as he always had, refusing interviews and declining public recognition whenever possible. The only noticeable difference was that he occasionally visited Harbor Pages without any carefully planned reason at all. Sometimes he purchased a single novel. Sometimes he simply stood beside the front window reading the handwritten recommendation cards while we shared quiet conversations over fresh coffee. He never asked me to change my ordinary life, and I never asked him to become someone different from the man he already was. Somewhere along the way, we stopped trying to explain ourselves and simply learned to trust what each day quietly revealed. One rainy evening, nearly a month after the fundraiser, I finished closing the bookstore later than usual and hurried toward the commuter train carrying another canvas bag filled with returned books. The station looked almost identical to the night when everything had first begun. Rain tapped softly against the platform. Passengers waited in comfortable silence, and the city lights reflected across the wet tracks like scattered stars. When the train arrived, I stepped inside and found an empty seat beside the window. Just before the doors closed, Vincent entered the same train car. He noticed me immediately and smiled with the quiet familiarity that had once seemed impossible. Without saying very much, he sat beside me. We spoke about ordinary things. A new mystery novel that had become unexpectedly popular. A neighborhood bakery that had finally reopened after renovations. A little girl from the literacy event who had proudly written her first short story. There was nothing dramatic about the conversation, and perhaps that was what made it meaningful. As the train continued through the rainy Seattle evening, Vincent's shoulders gradually relaxed. I glanced toward him just in time to see him close his eyes. A few moments later, his head gently rested against my shoulder once again. This time I did not freeze. I did not wonder whether the moment made sense. I simply remained still while the train carried us through the city. Across the aisle, a passenger quietly recognized Vincent before looking away with visible surprise, just as others had done weeks earlier. They could only see the powerful Alpha whose reputation filled newspaper headlines. They could not see the man who had finally found a place where he no longer needed to stay. Constantly alert, after several peaceful minutes, Vincent opened his eyes and looked at me with the same calm gratitude I remembered from our first meeting. I slept again, he said softly. I smiled before answering. Maybe it was never about the train. He laughed quietly, the sound carrying none of the weight that had surrounded him the first night we met. As the city lights slipped past the windows, I realized that the most extraordinary stories rarely begin when extraordinary people appear. They begin when ordinary kindness quietly gives someone permission to stop carrying the world alone, even if only for the length of a single train ride.